President Kennedy has been shot.
One small step for man.
To be self-evident that all men are created equal.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
By the spring of 1953, nearly 50,000 Americans had returned home from the Korean War in coffins. People at home continued to wonder how much longer they would have to endure this strange war being fought in a strange land.
I had two brothers who were serving in Korea at the same time, and I was scared to death because I wanted my brothers to come home. And when they came home, it was like, thank you, Lord. Greatest day in the world.
In that summer of 1953, the U.S. finally reached a truce agreement with the North Koreans and the Chinese. And Americans tried to put another war behind them. President Eisenhower had kept his campaign pledge to resolve the Korean conflict. Now he hoped to make America's domestic life his priority.
I believe in the future of the United States of America.
He was going to really take care of the United States. He was going to take care of us personally. And it was a good feeling.
The time was right for Dwight Eisenhower.
One of the things that I most wanted to do when he became president was to lower the rhetoric and lower the sense of crisis.
His countrymen were more than ready to relax. With the war over and America bursting with energy, it was time to focus on a more promising future. By 1953, the American people had been dealing with one crisis or another since 1929. The Great Depression, World War II, the Berlin blockade, and then Korea. Eisenhower felt it was now time to turn back the clock to the America of his childhood, a simpler country, where it turned out white males had the last word and where women kept the home fires burning, and the business of America was business. At first, many Americans seemed happy to oblige. But as the decade wore on, Eisenhower and they would discover that not everyone was ready to return to the old way of doing things. By late 1953, the economic boom that had arrived after the Second World War had already transformed the country.
We were a self-confident people for the first time since 1929. People putting money in the banks. The real wages were going up 4.5% a year. It's just incredible to think about that now.
America in the 1950s was very rapidly becoming a consumer society. People were buying more and selling more than ever before in history. For the first time, more Americans were doing white-collar work than manual labor. Advertising, marketing, and public relations were now the preferred professions.
Well, I can certainly do with 8 or 10,000, but I don't know anything about public relations.
Who does? You got a clean shirt, you bathe every day, and that's all there's to it.
In the shadow of the Cold War, it seemed almost patriotic to be part of the American economic miracle, to be a member of a corporate team and follow its rules.
When I became a salesman, like a man with a gray flannel suit, I was told where to buy my clothes. It might not have been a gray flannel suit, but it better be a blue one. And there was a lot of choices of colored shirts as long as they were white. You called attention to yourself if you deviated from the norm, and nobody did. Nobody did. We all looked the same.
I think people kind of like to be dressed alike and follow the same sort of social customs. You were expected to have at least 2 drinks at lunch, preferably martinis. If anyone said, "I'll have a Perrier," they would have been laughed at.
And when they advertised for secretaries, they specified good-looking. It was not a good time for women in the workplace.
Miss Lawrence, this is Mr. Rath. Miss Lawrence will be your secretary.
How do you do, Miss Lawrence?
Very glad to meet you, Mr. Rath.
We always give a new man the prettiest secretary.
There were no female managers. None. It wasn't even considered.
In the 1950s, the woman's place was in the home, in the embrace of a loving husband. By 1957, 97% of all marriageable men and women were married. And if they cared to have a social life, they stayed that way.
It was a couples society. We did things in couples, barbecues, and it's always couples. If we knew that the person was divorced, we might have a second thought about asking them. The thing was to be married and keep the home together.
More and more, that home was on America's new crabgrass frontier. In an era that favored conformity, it was perhaps no surprise that by the end of the decade, a quarter of the population lived in the tract homes of the modern suburb.
Moving in for us was the beginning of a happy experience, of a challenging experience. Everything was similar. One of my friends was Ruby. My phone rings and he says to me, "Hal, I have a problem." I said, "What's the matter?" He said, "I can't find my house."
It seemed kind of remote and bleak if you look at them from the air. But in those little cookie-cutter houses on those straight streets that met at right angles, a lot of good things were happening.
Children were being born at a very fast rate. It was a fabulous life.
And life was getting better for a lot of American families. Propelled by the powerful economy, they were stepping into the middle class at a rate of more than $1 million a year. With extra money to spend and plenty of shiny new merchandise to choose from, people bought things whether they needed them or not, sometimes just to match the pace of their neighbors.
We had an eye on consumer goods all the time. Keeping up with the Joneses. When people would give us a call on the phone that the television set was just delivered, it wouldn't be long before we'd be down having soda, watching the new television. And as soon as we left there, we would say, "That's what we have to have next."
A new television would soon become the thing that everyone had to have next. It was in the early 1950s that one of America's most intense love affairs blossomed most brightly.
We plug this thing in and turn on this box, and there are people there. Well, I want to tell you, we did not move for days.
You sat in front of that set even when there was nothing on but the test pattern. You thought, you can't tell, they're liable to put on something right now.
Television sets were rapidly becoming affordable for the average consumer, and as they did, the demand for new programming became overwhelming.
That's right, boys and girls.
Most television programs aired live with all the flaws of a live performance. Yet even with mistakes, most viewers loved the tube.
The television business was a sandbox where you could go in with almost any idea and you have a chance to do it. It was an amazing period of time.
Radio, long the staple of family entertainment, was virtually abandoned. Nimble talents like Milton Berle and the famous newscaster Edward R. Murrow made the transition to the new medium.
It brought us news. It brought us dramas. It had become an integral part of our life. And it wouldn't be unusual for your doctor to say, I'll see you at 7 o'clock on Tuesday, and you would say, I am very sorry. I Love Lucy is on. I have to see I Love Lucy.
By the mid-1950s, only a few years after their commercial introduction, television sets were in 3/4 of American homes. People now spent 1/3 of their waking hours in the glow of the box. Lured by entertainment, they became a captive audience for the salesman.
These three windows, ABC, CBS, and NBC, were a window on a world that a family could sit down and look out of and see what they didn't have.
Ah, I know what you're going to show us. A Westinghouse refrigerator.
A Westinghouse refrigerator freezer.
Everything that you did was geared at a family target audience.
It was a very conservative and repressive time, but it was also a time that was the beginning of change. Underneath all the conformity, you could see the beginnings of that change.
Hugh Hefner was 27 when he started Playboy magazine, at the time a daring challenge to the country's obscenity laws. His first Playmate of the Month was a rising young starlet named Marilyn Monroe. But after that, the pinup was just as likely to be the girl next door.
The girl next door notion of pinup photography was rooted in the notion that nice girls like sex too, that sex is okay. And that was, for the 50s, a very sensational point of view, and potentially a dangerous point of view. It was risky enough so I didn't put my name on the first issue.
Within a year, Playboy was selling 100,000 copies a month, and it was not the only thing threatening the status quo. Nothing worried traditionalists more than the new kind of music being performed by singers such as Lloyd Price.
Oh, now, Lordy, 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 Miss Claudia, girl, you sure look good to me.
Well, it was really race music. We had maybe 2 radio stations in New Orleans that played that music. It had no name to it. It was just music.
Ready, set, go, man, go. I got a gal that I love so
By 1955, the music did have a name. Rock and roll, and young people everywhere were listening to it. Wisconsin native Marty Rosenblum was then 15 years old.
I got my own portable radio, and at night I could pick up all the southern stations, and I heard Little Richard for the first time. And my whole world changed. Everything changed. I would call WAPL in Appleton, Wisconsin, and ask them to play Little Richard, and they said that the station manager wouldn't allow Little Richard on the radio because his was the devil's music. So I knew he was good.
It was a much more infectious kind of music that we'd ever heard before. And it had an edge.
There were suggestive things in it, and it was kind of risque, and the parents were saying, this is going to ruin our kids.
Their concern was that their daughters and even their sons was falling in love with black people.
Sam Phillips was the owner of Sun Records, a Southern music label.
You know what my answer was from day one was, I truly can look you straight in the eye and tell you they're not falling in love with black or white or green or yellow. They're falling in love with the vitality of the music.
And it wasn't long before white musicians like Bill Haley and his Comets were making the charts with rock hits of their own. But the music was still waiting for its first superstar. And in 1956, he arrived.
I was in this little soda shop, and on came this song, and this guy started singing, and there was like stillness, and then everybody started dancing, and this like wave of energy came over the place, and I said, my God, this is wonderful. I turned around to the girl next to me, and I said, who was that? And she looked at me as if I was like from another planet, and she said just one word. She said, Elvis.
The year that I saw Elvis Presley, the electricity was so high. Had you put that much energy in work, you would have collapsed.
It wasn't just that Elvis was white and sounded black. His haircut and his hips spoke to rebellious feelings in young people all across America.
And the funny thing is that you screamed so much you really couldn't hear him, but you felt you had to scream. I mean, it was just...
Kids were screaming with joy, and parents were screaming in protest. Elvis may have been white, but his songs and his moves still offended many. In July 1956, Elvis Presley's act was called vulgar and suggestive by the tremendously popular columnist and television show host Ed Sullivan. Less than 2 months later, Sullivan booked the singer on his show.
Ready, set, go and go. I got a gal that I love so.
It's the minister of culture in America and the minister of morality surrendering to the youth culture. And therefore, that's a very big political moment. We cannot hold the line anymore. If I hold the line and keep Elvis off, I'm going to fail. And that's a very important moment. His going on Ed Sullivan symbolized that it had happened.
Rock and roll.
Rock and roll was here to stay. It had become the soundtrack for a new era of change.
Here's Jerry Lee Lewis, Great Balls of Fire. You shake my nerves and you rattle my brain.
In 1957, a television program called American Bandstand went national on the ABC network. The show's target audience quickly demonstrated its newfound power by turning Bandstand and its host, Dick Clark, into overnight icons.
Every kid watched. There was a story about once a police chief was afraid a rumble was going to happen, a street fight, because no kids were around. And they conducted a door-to-door search. They found all the kids were watching the bandstand.
I remember feeling this tremendous feeling of confirmation that I belong to a group of people called Teenager, and we have our own music.
All of a sudden, you know, I felt that I could express myself. I could be free. I could dance and I could shake around and I could have fun. There was no stopping us, you know? The parents didn't have a chance.
What must a poet look like? Should he have long...
Another way that the young were breaking away was through their use of language. The beat movement thrived in the coffee houses of New York's Greenwich Village.
As the wiper squeaked in time on the glass, like angry reptiles running from an enemy.
The village has a life and language all its own. If you dig it, you're hip. If you don't, man, you're square.
Beatniks were the forefathers of the 1960s counterculture, challenging the conformity of the 50s by ridiculing mainstream values.
My mom wanted a new kitchen. She wanted new appliances. That was her self-identity. And the Beats were saying, why are you identifying with material things? There's more.
An even more significant challenge to the complacent 50s came from America's black community. Living in the consumer society but having few of its advantages, they chose this moment to make white America live up to its ideals. Amazingly, 50s America had moved little beyond the days of Jim Crow. Particularly in the South, life among blacks and whites remained separate and unequal.
It was no way you could be black in this country and not be affected by it. Here I was selling millions of records around the world, hero everywhere, and I couldn't get a hot dog in Baltimore unless I went to the back door.
It wasn't right, but that's just how it was. That was just life.
On December the 1st, 1955, on a public bus in Montgomery, Alabama, life began to change. By refusing to give up her seat to a white man, a tired seamstress named Rosa Parks quietly ignited a revolution.
The day that Rosa Parks was arrested, a low murmur went through the whole city. And overnight, this thing bloomed.
Led by a charismatic young preacher named Martin Luther King, the city's black community organized a peaceful boycott of the buses. They walked instead.
We will do it in an orderly fashion. This is a non-violent protest. We're depending on moral and spiritual forces.
White policemen responded by arresting black carpool drivers. White extremists bombed King's home.
Martin always said, you know, if you don't have anything that you die for, what do you have to live for? Nobody thought we could stay off the buses. None of those people wanted to lose their jobs. But Martin Luther had instilled in them so rightly that we must all make a sacrifice, that the buses continue to run empty.
They did, for 381 days. On November the 13th, 1956, the Supreme Court ordered the buses desegregated. Martin Luther King was now the undisputed leader of the civil rights movement.
The colored population idolized Martin Luther.
We are not going back to the buses bragging about a victory.
People experienced a self-esteem that they had never experienced before. And they had been given
for the last 12 months.
A light, a beacon at the end of the tunnel.
That light reached Melba Beals, a 15-year-old high school student in Little Rock, Arkansas.
I was very conscious of what was going on and wanting it to wash over me and wash over Little Rock.
It was about to. In 1954, the Supreme Court had ordered the integration of all public schools in its famous decision Brown versus the Board of Education. 3 years later, that decision would be severely tested at Little Rock's all-white Central High School. Despite the federal court order, Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus had no intention of allowing black students to attend Central High, and he ordered the Arkansas National Guard to surround the school. On September the 3rd, Melba Beals and 8 other black students walked towards Central High. One, Elizabeth Eckford, became separated from her friends and was surrounded by a white mob that included Ann Thompson.
There was just a lot of electricity in the air. It was almost a circus-like atmosphere. All these parents on the sideline urging us on and telling us, you know, get out there, don't let them get in.
There are mobs on her heels, you know, like dogs, nipping at her. Policemen are watching this. Every time she tries to step between them, they close ranks on her.
If Central High was to be integrated, it would have to be by order of the president. Eisenhower was at first reluctant to interfere.
His record on civil rights was not a good one until 1957, in the crisis at Little Rock. And there, a fundamental question was dealt with. Do the states have the right to impose their own social order in defiance of federal court orders? Eisenhower answered it decisively, said, no, we have made a national commitment. We are going to desegregate this society. And if it takes the 101st Airborne to do it, so be it.
This is awful. It was, I mean, that is vivid still. You know, I could just see Little Rock just being in a state of siege by the troops, you know. That was real fear.
Three weeks after the Little Rock Nine were turned away from Central High, they returned, accompanied by troops of the 101st Airborne.
We're all in an Army station wagon, machine gun mounts. It's a pretty heady day. It's not what everybody gets to go to school. You got 1,000 paratroopers, you got helicopters, Jeeps in front, Jeeps behind.
And we stepped out of the Jeep into this square of soldiers who were serious. You know, as I walked up the steps that day at Central High School, I can remember the click of the leather boots on those stairs. And I remember being so impressed by who they were. You know, these are Americans. I'm an American. And so the first time I get the feeling that there is hope, that there is a reason I salute the flag, that this is what America is about.
I felt that Little Rock would never be the same again. We would never know life as we've known it again, because 9 people walked into a school building.
My teenage models had been the kids who danced on American Bandstand. And all of a sudden come the Little Rock Nine. And I can remember having the feeling that they've been tied and tested, and they've survived. Someday, in some way, I'm going to be tested this way too. So I think when the movement comes along in the 1960s, I'm ready for it.
By the late 1950s, driven by the powerful economy, the American people's long-running fascination with automobiles was changing the very fabric of the country.
The car came to be the dominant symbol of American life and had an impact on American life that is difficult to exaggerate.
Americans were now confronted with a dazzling array of choices on the showroom floors. So many that for the first time, people began to view cars the same way that they once viewed clothes or hairdos, as an emblem of their personality.
Ford Thunderbird. Even the name had a ring to it.
A yellow station wagon. A station wagon provides room in the back to carry the lawnmower that's broken.
My boyfriend drove a Chevrolet, and I thought, that's the prettiest car I've ever seen in my life. I felt like a queen in that car.
General Motors had a budget the size of Poland's. Nationwide, every 7th job was related to the automobile industry. The term drive-in became a part of the language. There was a national hotel chain created entirely for road travelers, and a restaurant that spoke exclusively to a newly mobile country. But the most profound effect of the car on American life, the one that actually altered the landscape, was the immense new federal highway system begun in 1956. The largest public works project in history, forever connected American motorists from city to city, from coast to coast.
We used to study those maps, which would show you proposed interstate highway under construction, and then the payoff, completed and open. And we'd get on those interstates and run those great big cars with the big fins on them. It was just wonderful. Just opened up the whole world to us.
What most Americans did not realize was that the freeways had been built with an ulterior motive. The overpasses freedom-loving motorists were driving under were built 15 feet high in order to allow the easy movement of missile systems. President Eisenhower approved the project in part because he wanted military traffic to be able to move easily in the event of a national crisis. It had taken the Soviets 4 years to duplicate the American success with the atomic bomb. It took only 8 months for them to do the same with the hydrogen bomb.
Well, there wasn't any doubt that everybody was building them as fast as they could. We've got to build them, we've got to improve them, and keep at it, keep at it, keep at it.
The need to test the new weapons was seen as so urgent that the U.S. government even put its own troops in harm's way.
10 seconds.
Within a few months of the successful Soviet hydrogen test in 1953, several thousand American troops were ordered into trenches in the Arizona desert. One of them was Korean War veteran Reason Wehrheim.
The purpose of it was to test the reaction of the troops to an atomic bomb.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
That shot went off. You see this real bright light. With your hands over your eyes, you could see the bones in your hands. And there's this god-awful noise. It just feels like it's compressing your head. It's so loud. There's a feeling like you're in a vacuum cleaner, like your whole body's being vacuumed. The house that was in front of us was no longer in front of us. It was gone. Of the 2,584 men that were there, there's only 3 of us still alive.
How many Americans were affected altogether can never be fully determined. The fallout from this explosion, known as Shot Simon, reached as far away as New Jersey, among the dirtiest of the 200 above-ground nuclear tests that took place between 1954 and 1958. The same frenzied pace of experimentation was applied to the rocket program. Both superpowers saw them as crucial for the delivery of powerful nuclear payloads. American scientists were not always having much luck.
I saw the rockets that were pointed north go south, and those that were pointed south go north. I saw one go straight up in the air and explode. I saw one go straight up and come straight back down again. But never during those 100 launches did I see anything go right.
On October the 4th, 1957, someone did get it right.
We say, attention, all radio stations of the Soviet Union are broadcasting.
The first artificial Earth satellite in the world has now been created. This first satellite was today successfully launched in the U.S.
This beep, 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 what is it? Sputnik. Sputnik is around the globe. Who did it? We did it. The Soviet Union. First in the space.
And I can remember going out to my backyard one night, looking up at this bright streak going across the sky, and I felt a sudden sinking feeling, one of almost terror.
Now, suddenly, you've got Soviet missiles that can reach into the Dakotas, can hit Chicago.
With a surprise attack possible for the first time, Americans began to look at the sky differently, now as a place from which terror might reign, and to learn some new terms like duck and cover.
I felt that the threat to America had been increased, that the Soviet Union had upped the ante. While we were playing cops and robbers hide and seek in our backyards and our front yards, there was the gnawing anxiety that it could all end instantaneously.
July 25th, 1959, at a U.S. exhibition in Moscow, Soviet Premier Khrushchev and American Vice President Nixon discussed the relative merits of communism and capitalism.
There are some instances where you may be ahead of us. For example, in the development of the thrust of your rockets for the investigation.
Both of them was built from the same material. They were tough, and they want to show each other that their society is better.
There may be some instances, for example, color television, where we're ahead of you. But
what became known as the kitchen debate seemed to demonstrate America's new insecurity in the world.
You never concede anything.
Sputnik had been a technological Pearl Harbor.
It began a tremendous sense of self-appraisal. Are we falling behind the Russians? What are we teaching our children? I remember Life magazine doing a whole spread on contrasting a Soviet and an American high school. And little Ivana and Ivan were studying rocket physics, and Jim and Sue were bopping in the high school gym. And the clear message of this was, that in 10 or 15 years, we would be a client state of the Soviet Union because we were wasting our lives dancing away and dating while these people were working 20-hour days.
Suddenly, an American embrace of intellectualism was being seen on campuses, in libraries,
from New York City, Mr.
and on new television quiz shows,
and returning with
including 21.
$500.
As the 50s gave way to the 60s, a new generation became a force in popular culture and in politics. That's on the next episode of The Century, America's Time. I'm Peter Jennings. We hope you'll join us. At the lunch counter in this Greensboro, North Carolina Woolworths, in February of 1960, 4 college freshmen took a stand by simply sitting down.
The day that we decided to sit down, we figured we could go to jail. If that was what we faced, then it was worth doing that.
By asking for a cup of coffee and a donut, Joe McNeil and his friends had taken on segregation an established way of life in the American South, one which would not allow blacks to eat with whites at a lunch counter or use the same restrooms or drink from the same water fountains.
There comes a time in life where you say, hey, we're going to confront it and see where it goes.
Within weeks of the Greensboro sit-in, similar protests were breaking out in more than 30 southern cities.
There was an astounding, rapid ripple effect, because every time you turned on the radio or TV, there was another sit-in someplace. And all of the people sitting in were young.
We had crossed the line. I was no longer afraid of being arrested and afraid to go to jail. The first time I got arrested, I tell you, I was free. I was liberated.
Young people getting arrested on purpose so they could be free. They touched the conscience of America.
As we began to see what was coming out of the South, we knew that there was something wrong in this country. And I think that that had a powerful effect on us. The effect was to believe that it was possible to make change in the world, and that you had a responsibility to take part in that change.
In the early 1960s, young people came to the forefront in America. The civil rights movement was often driven by their anger. The culture of the era was certainly shaped by their tastes and desires. The country would elect its youngest president at the beginning of the decade. His energy and enthusiasm seemed to promise a revitalized nation, a country spirited and strong enough to meet the challenges at home and, in an increasingly dangerous world, the challenges abroad. The Cold War's shadow continued to hang like a dark cloud over an otherwise optimistic horizon. The presidential candidates in 1960, Massachusetts Senator John Kennedy and Vice President Richard Nixon, were only in their mid-40s. Both were ardent Cold Warriors.
But I am not satisfied as an American to be second to the Soviet Union.
What we want to do is not to turn their way, but to do it our way. And that's exactly what we're talking about in this campaign.
Both men were Navy veterans. The candidates had been freshman congressmen together after the war. But somehow Kennedy seemed the younger and identified himself as the candidate of a new generation. The favorite candidate of much of the entertainment community reached the high point of his campaign in a series of debates on television.
These were the first presidential debates ever. Ever. There'd never been a presidential debate before.
Smith, Senator Kennedy.
And the fact that it was happening live and on television gave it a kind of theater that was remarkable.
The question now is, can freedom be maintained?
The candidates were close on the issues, particularly on a tough stand against the Soviet Union.
I, of course, disagree with Senator Kennedy.
Studies after the debate show that those who heard it on the radio thought Mr. Nixon had won. Those who saw it on television gave the edge to Kennedy.
Supply and demand into balance. Attempt
The image that came over definitely favored Kennedy.
Surplus, which breaks the price.
To see his earnestness, to feel his charm, to feel his idealism, I'm convinced that he would not have won without the debates.
After the closest presidential election of the century, the country's oldest elected president at the time was succeeded by its youngest.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
It was very
exhilarating in a sense to have a man as young and articulate and electric as John Kennedy was. What he said was quite hawkish when you look back on it.
We shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
After the soaring words of the inaugural speech, the inaugural parties gave final proof to the notion that a younger and more glamorous administration had arrived.
I remember Lenny Bruce saying, "Isn't it great to have a president who you can imagine sleeping with his wife?" And I thought at the time, God, I think that too. You could identify with the man in that sense. He had, it was the first president that seemed like a guy, not like something on a dollar bill.
The idea of a White House run and staffed by younger people, with a 32-year-old chief speechwriter and a press secretary in his 30s, and all these people around Kennedy, there was that feeling that, well, if they're running the political system, surely we can be somehow involved in it.
We wanted to serve. We wanted to do something because young people, me included, in those days, did wonder how we were ever going to top the generation before us. Our fathers had fought World War II. They had won. They had beaten a depression in some way. What are we going to do?
On April the 12th, 1961, the Soviets sent cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin into orbit around the globe.
The first Sputnik in '57 and then Yuri Gagarin going into space in '61 terrified the American people. People were sitting around and talking about what would we do if the Russians had arms, missiles, whatever, on the moon, and could shoot. We were making this stuff up, but shoot at us at will, and we'd have to surrender. You know, we had to choose better red than dead. That's what people were thinking then.
In what would become a spiraling series of superpower moves and countermoves, just 3 weeks after the Soviets' manned launch, the U.S. sent astronaut Alan Shepard into space. And President Kennedy promised even greater heights.
We choose to go to the moon.
A man on the moon, walking on the moon? Now, in this decade?
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
You gotta be kidding. But Kennedy wasn't kidding.
Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
This bold push into space was also seen as an aggressive manifestation of the Cold War. And so was a Kennedy-supported CIA scheme in April of 1961 to land Cuban exiles in their homeland to ignite an uprising against Fidel Castro. When the mission failed, leaving the exiles stranded at Cuba's Bay of Pigs, America and the president were humiliated. 3 months later, as if sensing American weakness, Khrushchev demanded that all Allied forces be removed from Berlin.
We cannot and will not permit the communists to drive us out of Berlin, either gradually or by force.
Kennedy put the United States pretty close to a war footing. A lot of people like me got draft notices. It looked like we were going to war.
For the second time in the century, Americans faced the threat of war over Berlin. But now, both sides had nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them. No president ever spoke more frankly to the nation about the real possibility of nuclear war.
In the event of an attack, the lives of those families which are not hit in a nuclear blast and fire can still be saved if they can be warned to take shelter and if that shelter is available. We owe that kind of insurance to our families and to our country.
Families were advised to build bomb shelters. Schools held atomic attack drills.
When I was a kid, I was very worried about the bomb. And I used to sit under that desk thinking, now, would the radiation fall on top of the desk and miss me? But what happens when I get out from under the desk? Then will the radiation fall on me? I didn't quite get it, but it didn't seem to be sensible that I was hiding under this desk. And so I had this worry, and everybody talked about this worry about the bomb.
This nuclear threat over Berlin was diffused, but the Soviet-American confrontation would continue. In October of 1961, the Soviets began building the Berlin Wall. The wall would become a symbol of the Cold War's brutal reality. The newsreels presented Americans with haunting images of people risking their lives to escape communism.
Once a country went communist, it stayed communist. They had secret police and the whole totalitarian structures so that there was no regressing. That the Soviet Union and its allies were a formidable global presence seemed very clear to me.
An even more direct threat to American security began to unfold on October the 14th, 1962, when American U-2 surveillance planes flying over Cuba made a discovery.
It was unbelievable. I couldn't believe that the Soviets would introduce nuclear-tipped missiles into Cuba, targeted on the eastern part of the United States. They never had moved nuclear weapons off the soil of the Soviet Union. We didn't believe they would. They did.
It was my father's decision and his own idea. It was only one reason: to show that we are great power and we will protect all our allies, and if anybody will try to fight against our allies, that will mean the beginning of the Third World War.
The Cuban Missile Crisis would last for 13 days that October. The president and his most trusted advisors tried to figure out how to get Khrushchev to remove the missiles from Cuba.
As far as the president was concerned, this was a superpower confrontation. It was the Soviets who would put nuclear missiles in Cuba. It was the Soviets who would have to remove them.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
The U.S. military was put on the maximum level of alert, DEFCON 2. The president ordered the Navy to mount a blockade around Cuba.
All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. This quarantine will be extended, if needed, to other types of cargo and carriers.
For 72 hours, the world watched and waited as Soviet ships approached the quarantine line.
They kept coming, they kept coming, they kept coming, they kept coming. So there would be these days of incredible tension. Millions of Americans believed that they were about to die. We literally sat and talked about the fact that we were living then out in the wilds of New Jersey, and were we far away from New York City to survive?
I remember that really being a terrifying moment. I was at NYU at the time. And the professor was sitting there, and he looked up at the clock on the wall, and he goes, well, they'll be meeting about now. They're meeting now, so we'll just have to wait. And there was like deep silence, and nothing happened, you know. It was a deep breath.
And then the Soviet premier ordered his ships to turn back. In the end, the Soviet leader agreed to withdraw the missiles in return for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba.
There isn't going to be any learning curve with respect to nuclear weapons. You make a mistake with respect to a decision to use nuclear weapons, you're going to destroy nations. Both Khrushchev and Kennedy realized how close they'd come, and they were determined to avoid that in the future.
In 1961, the author James Baldwin wrote, "To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage all the time."
It was two worlds, a black world and a white world. As a young child, I remember very well seeing the signs, and I resented it.
If you went to the Dairy Queen, white people would go in and sit down. You got your ice cream at a window.
I never rode a bus because I knew I'd have to sit in the back. I didn't go downtown to the movie theaters because I'd have to sit in the Jim Crow gallery.
I remember on one occasion I tried to go to the county library, and we couldn't even go in and check out of a book.
That did not change until the Civil Rights Movement.
In the early 1960s, young people would take the lead in the battle for racial equality. Federal courts had ruled that segregated waiting areas in bus stations were illegal, but the law was not being enforced. To pressure the Kennedy administration to intervene, activists rode public buses into the Deep South to integrate the facilities. Outside of Anniston, Alabama, the bus carrying the first group of self-proclaimed Freedom Riders was firebombed.
By the time the Freedom Ride started, there was a realization that some of us would have to die and that we should not fear death. And we liken this very much to military service, that if you serve your country in the military, you might lose your life. We were serving our country at home.
We knew that this was a very dangerous mission, but we felt we had a moral obligation and a mandate to make this trip.
John Lewis, then a student leader, was a Freedom Rider on a bus that arrived in Montgomery, Alabama.
The very moment we started down the steps, a mob out of nowhere, people by the hundreds, came out with baseball bats, stones, chains, and started beating us. I was hit in the head with a wooden crate, and I was left lying unconscious in a pool of blood. I thought I was going to die.
Many of the young people in the Civil Rights Movement united in an organization called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC.
SNCC is special because we are young. We're 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 year old. Most of us have dropped out of school, so we're no longer students, but we don't have mortgages, we don't have car payments, we don't have families, we don't have husbands and wives and children. So we can do these things. And because we're young, we're also foolish, and we're willing to take risks.
We wanted to create a mass movement. We wanted to get hundreds and thousands of people involved.
We had been talking about developing a nonviolent army that would be prepared to go into a community, be arrested, court arrest, and so forth, break down that fear of jail as a weapon, and also break down the infrastructure of the local area by filling up their jails.
All right, let's stop it right here.
It was a tactic that SNCC took to Albany, Georgia.
Anybody who found the courage to be involved could be involved.
In the first weeks of the Albany campaign, more than 500 young people were arrested.
Once you get in jail, it's a sobering experience because jail is not like a rally and jail is not like a march. Some people would get into jail, they would clang those doors and they would actually cry. And then there would be people who felt that we're in jail and we need to pray. Then there were teenagers who wanted to do rock and roll, or they were talking about their boyfriends. And it was in jail where I began to be asked to sing a lot. And no money to go to bail. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. Paul and Silas began to shout. Jail door open and they walked out. Keep your eyes on. If you're in the movement, all of the singing is one way of being heard and announcing your presence. You can't sing a song without producing power. And you will often see people singing in the face of police. If I sing, you stand in my sound. In Albany, Georgia, we forced the jails open by numbers, and they could not stop us from singing and praying.
The movement was energized, but the law did not change. The 9-month effort to desegregate Albany, Georgia, failed. The next major campaign was fought on even tougher ground.
It was probably the most violent and vicious racist city in the South. There had been 60 bombings of black people's homes in Birmingham in 61 and 62.
One target for the movement in Birmingham was to desegregate the schools. Alabama's governor, George Wallace, had promised they would stay white.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Our demonstrations in Birmingham were usually simply marches to the courthouse or to City Hall. And we almost never got more than 2 blocks from the church, and then we were arrested.
Day after day, hundreds of demonstrators filled the Birmingham jails. Among those arrested was the organizer of the Birmingham campaign, the Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr. By then, he was the acknowledged leader of the entire civil rights movement.
My heroes for the second half of the 20th century, Martin Luther King. All of these people are people who accepted the fact that you have to put everything online. Because if you don't, you're not going to get anything. Not in America. Because America is not going to change. Only you can change.
As part of the campaign, Dr. King enlisted an army of school children, aged 6 to 16. After the first day of demonstrations, nearly 1,000 of them had been herded into police vans and sent to jail. The next day, the police changed their tactics.
The law enforcement in Birmingham was headed by one Bull Connor. And Bull Connor was an old-fashioned lock 'em up, throw 'em in jail, throw away the key, beat 'em up, put dogs on them, hose them down with fire hoses. Anything he could think of to try to stop this movement by force, he did.
I watched the violence in Birmingham on TV. It shocked me to see the dogs being unleashed on people, and it shamed me.
This was the front page of every major newspaper in the world, and it told a story that America was ashamed of.
Fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city, north and south, where legal remedies are not at hand. Redress is sought in the streets. Next week, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it has not fully made in this century to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
trying to raise congressional support for the Kennedy Civil Rights Bill, civil rights leaders called for a march on Washington. On August the 28th, 1963, more than 200,000 people showed up.
We knew it was a special day. And once I got there and saw the crowds coming from all over America, black and white, poor people, rich people, show business, politicians, Martin called it a coalition of goodwill, or a coalition of conscience that could change the soul of the nation on the race issue.
This was bringing a mass meeting into the homes of millions of Americans who were seeing this thing that I had seen over and over and over again in small town churches everywhere, seeing this for the first time and hearing the oratory of America's premier orator, Martin Luther King.
No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream.
I remember thinking when I saw Martin Luther King that he was going in his dream to bring the nation along, that he was irresistible in his call to mercy and love. I mean, that he was absolutely the most irresistible voice that had ever been heard.
Freedom and justice, I have a dream. My poor little children one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
You know, I was a little young. I do remember it. Martin Luther King was a very powerful effect on me, but it wasn't so much that I understood what he was saying, but I knew that he stood for me because I needed somebody to stand for me.
We will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
To me, that day represented one of the finest hours in American history.
In the early 1960s, answering the president's call to action, young people had a new way in which to serve: the Peace Corps. The Corps' first director was the president's brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver.
Messages kept pouring into the White House from people, younger people for the most part, but older people too, saying, yes, I'm ready to serve.
I thought joining the Peace Corps was a perfect way to do good in the world. I mean, I thought it was sort of hands across the ocean. Then I was going to go and help the poor people of the world do something better with their lives.
Marnie Mueller was sent to Guayaquil, Ecuador.
It was somehow giving people the notion that if they got together, they had power to make change.
The Peace Corps was also a way to counter the appeal of communism in the developing world. Other young Americans responded to the president's Cold War call more directly.
We're being trained to be in the military, to do what the military does, to fight if we have to defend the country. So, I mean, we all wanted to go. We thought, I mean, this was our job.
On the same day that President Kennedy established the Peace Corps, he provided more funds for an elite group of warriors called the Special Forces. They would become known as the Green Berets. The very first mission for these highly trained soldiers would be in Vietnam, in Southeast Asia. When President Kennedy took office, there were 1,000 military advisors in South Vietnam, sent there to defend against what America believed was communist expansion. It was a policy based on something called the domino theory.
In a sense, we saw if Vietnam falls, the dominoes will fall. Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, the rest of Southeast Asia would fall under communist domination, and they would be strengthened across the globe. And it was to prevent that Kennedy felt he had to make a move to strengthen the South Vietnamese government.
The South Vietnamese government run by Ngo Dinh Diem at the time needed the help. The leader of North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh, wanted the North and South to be reunited. He was supplying guerrillas in South Vietnam who were growing in numbers and aggressiveness.
In Vietnam, you had an insurgency, Viet Cong. They are the insurgents. We become specialists in counterinsurgents.
Bill Bowles was one of the first special forces sent to train South Vietnamese troops in the fall of 1961. President Kennedy had increased the number of military advisors to more than 3,000.
We had trained this civilian irregular defense group for maybe a month, and we decided to send them to villages around Da Nang, and we had 4 Americans out there. And on the way between the villages, they were ambushed by the Viet Cong. 2 of my buddies were killed, and 2 others were missing. I was shocked. I guess more than anything, it brought home the idea, hey, this is not play. This is not a game. This is not a training exercise anymore. This is kill or be killed.
By 1963, the situation was deteriorating. On the streets of the South Vietnamese capital, Saigon, President Diem, desperate to maintain control, was cracking down on his political and religious opponents. In protest, Buddhist monks set themselves on fire. For many Americans, these were the first television images they saw of Vietnam.
It was a horrible, horrible experience because in a sense, we saw Vietnam disintegrating before our eyes, or at least the structure of the state disintegrating. Diem had lost control of it.
American policymakers supported a coup to remove Diem, which resulted in his assassination. U.S. complicity in Diem's death and the resulting turmoil in South Vietnam only deepened America's involvement.
As I left here in '63, it was obvious that the war was escalating. We had camps in places that you couldn't even say the name. And we had more people getting killed than ever before.
America would commit more and more soldiers. It would become the longest war in American history. It was fought largely by young men, described by one journalist as rock and rollers with one foot in the grave. In the summer of 1963, John F. Kennedy's political and personal ratings were the highest of his presidency.
Because he was the first young president, he was a towering cultural figure. I mean, the pictures of him walking around with his little kids and whatnot had enormous impact. It made us feel 10 feet high. We thought that we were invulnerable.
The United States, and what a crowd, what a tremendous welcome he's getting now. And there's Jackie. She's getting just as big a welcome, and the crowd is absolutely going wild. This is a friendly crowd in downtown Dallas as the President and the First Lady pass by.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route. Stand by just a moment, please.
It did seem as though everything came unpinned. I was sitting in the dental chair when the first bulletin came over, but then the bulletins became increasingly serious, so that within an hour, about the time I was out of the chair, Jack Kennedy was dead.
Dallas, November 22nd. President John F. Kennedy was shot and killed here today, period. The president suffered a massive gunshot wound in the brain and was pronounced dead at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
So I dictated my story that day. And this was such an unexpected, unbelievable thing that had happened. It was terribly emotional. No Americans living at that time had ever witnessed anything like this, the assassination of a president. I mean, that assassin's bullet killed something else. The feeling of, if you're exalted, you're invulnerable. All of a sudden, you know, even this guy is vulnerable, for God's sake.
I cried, like many Americans. No, we had our differences, but I felt we had lost a friend. We had lost a leader. He was such a source of inspiration. How did we make it? How did we survive? Where did we go from here?
With the death of Kennedy, the end of the feeling of progress was never going to end. The innocence, the reality, a slap in the face, a national car crash.
I think some of the self-confidence of America died that day. Some of the optimism of America died that day. Walking up Connecticut Avenue to the church, and you'd look at the people who were watching us walk up the street, and there was absolute incredulity on the face of every living person. You get their eyes and your eyes, and what they were looking at you for was hopefully to get some expression from your face, from your eyes, that would help them to understand what had happened and why. And nobody understood it.
For an already shaken America, there were yet more crises ahead. We'll see that on the next episode of The Century, America's Time. I'm Peter Jennings. Thank you for joining us. As world fairs had in the past, the fair in 1964 provided a timely glimpse of the planet's current realities and future expectations. The New York Times described it as a glittering mirror of our national opulence. It seemed to portend a future where the biggest worry for average Americans would be how to spend their leisure time.
I just took it for granted that I'd always have a roof over my head and enough to eat. The thought that I'd have to worry about where my next meal was coming from, these thoughts just didn't occur to me. But of course, part of the reason we could think that way is that we took prosperity more or less for granted.
In his speech at the World's Fair, President Lyndon Johnson touted a world of prosperity.
But that people, they shall have the best. All of these dreams.
Only to find himself interrupted in mid-speech by demonstrators who felt themselves frozen out of the world. Despite a lengthy struggle, millions of black Americans still did not share in the nation's prosperity or enjoy the full rights of their citizenship. In 1964, many expected that such inequities would soon be addressed.
We thought that essentially the material problems of the world had been solved, and that the important thing now is to solve the moral problems.
there was a society that had to be changed, and it was not going to be changed unless some people decided that they would dedicate their lives to changing it. It was not going to change spontaneously.
The World's Fair that year was held in Flushing Meadows, New York. It was supposed to promote the culture and customs of people everywhere, in keeping with its theme of peace through understanding. But it would not be long before Americans would be driven apart by societal disagreements within their own borders, and a terrible, costly war on the other side of the globe. The country was not about to experience much of either peace or understanding. In the mid-1960s, the determination to challenge traditional boundaries seemed to be growing in almost every arena. Perhaps most striking was a broadening struggle for civil rights, a struggle that many whites now joined in large numbers. In the summer of 1964, hundreds of college students, white and black, headed south to Mississippi, where many blacks were still mired in a Jim Crow world of poverty and political impotence. These students from the North hoped to register black voters and establish so-called freedom schools to teach literacy skills to those who'd been denied them. They were traveling into a world where many people were set in their ways. President Lyndon Johnson warned the students that the federal government could not guarantee their safety.
They received a lot of training in order to prepare them for life in Mississippi, which was not going to be very easy. It wasn't easy for us, and we tried to make that very clear to people. I mean, our lives are in imminent danger every minute of the day.
When we crossed the line into Mississippi, and it said, "Mississippi welcomes you," it was the first time I felt really afraid.
In the first group to arrive in Mississippi were students Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, and James Cheney. Within days, all three of them were missing.
Bob Moses, who was the head of the Mississippi Summer Project, brought the group together, told us that they were missing, and it was clear to all of us that it was extremely likely that they were dead.
Put your feet up in there and walk off on in there.
6 weeks after their disappearance, the three were discovered buried in an earthen dam, shot in the head. In that summer of 1964, the Ku Klux Klan was still trying to stop the forces of change. But among the students and in the homes and churches of the black community, the feeling grew stronger that change could not be prevented.
We went up to the home of a very poor black woman, sharecropper's shack. She had a bunch of kids. She came to the door, she looked at her feet, she said yas'm, no'm, to everything we said. And we tried to persuade her to sign this. And it was very clear if she signed it, she might get thrown out of her home. After a few minutes of talking, she suddenly straightened up, looked us in the eyes, and said, "I'll sign it." And she signed it. That's how powerful the movement was.
In late 1964, another fight was looming for Americans, this one thousands of miles from home, and with far more devastating consequences. For several years, American advisors had been sent to South Vietnam to help prevent what the administration said was a takeover by the communist North. Things were not going well in the South. President Lyndon Johnson decided to dramatically increase the U.S. military commitment to Vietnam. And just as they had throughout history, young Americans answered the call to arms.
I didn't want to see my son go, and he promised nothing was going to happen to him, you know, and that it was going to be over very shortly, and he'd be home before I knew it.
You grew up watching those John Wayne movies where the good guys always win. I was being John Wayne, I was going to go, and I was going to beat them, and nothing could hurt me.
Like many other young men in 1965, Jack Bronson knew very little about war, except that America didn't lose them. This one looked at first to be no exception. The United States, which had defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan and held back the Communist Chinese and Korea, now faced a Third World Army of North Vietnamese soldiers and South Vietnamese Viet Cong guerrillas. American commanders confidently predicted a swift and positive conclusion.
I was excited about going to war. The whole battalion was excited about going to war. We were gung-ho.
With 125,000 fresh troops and an armada of helicopters ranging all over South Vietnam, American generals were spoiling for a good fight. They were about to get one. On November the 15th, 1965, Lieutenant Larry Gwyn's unit was helicoptered to a valley in central Vietnam near the Cambodian border. They had gone to intersect the North Vietnamese supply routes to the south. North Vietnamese soldiers watched them arrive.
It was my first real hot landing zone. And it was so hot that I had exited my ship, knelt in the grass for about 10 seconds, and a guy pops up next to me whom I knew had just been shot through the shoulder and said, "I'm hit, Lieutenant."
A major battle with the enemy was just what the military brass had been hoping for, only it was not going according to plan. At 10 in the morning, Lieutenant Gwyn was fighting for his life.
Our first platoon was overrun. Our second platoon was pinned down by mortar fire. I saw about 40 North Vietnamese soldiers coming across the landing zone at us. And all I did was say, "Here they come," and start shooting at them.
1 p.m. The American commander sent out an emergency signal. Broken arrow. U.S. troops in danger of being overrun. Every available aircraft was called in against the North Vietnamese positions. Including the giant B-52 bombers.
The B-52 is terrible. Terrible in many ways, because firstly, there was no way you can fight back it. You can't run. There's no time for you to run. So you just lay there, waited for the death to come and grip you.
And thousands of men died in those desperate hours. By the time the battle was over, 3,500 North Vietnamese and 305 Americans had been killed. It was obvious to the men in the field what lay ahead. Preoccupied as he was with the growing war in Vietnam, President Johnson knew that he had to address problems at home. Despite America's prosperity, 40 million citizens still live below the poverty line.
And this administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
In May 1964, the president unveiled the grand plan for what he called the Great Society. Mr. Johnson hoped to match the power and vitality of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, with a list of welfare, job, and educational opportunities to aid underprivileged Americans. But the privilege that many Southern blacks most desired was the right to vote, still often denied them. In Selma, Alabama, 97% of 15,000 eligible black voters were unregistered. Some because of cynicism or apathy, but most because they faced violence and intimidation from local authorities.
People could only attempt to register on the first and third Mondays of each month.
The Board of Registrars is not in session this afternoon as you were informed. You came down to make a mockery out of
courthouse.
And you had to get some white person to vouch that you were a good character. No white person in his right mind in the state of Alabama was going to vouch that a black person was a good character.
If we're wrong, why don't you arrest us? We've come to register.
Selma rapidly became the new flashpoint of the civil rights movement. On March the 7th, 1965, 600 civil rights activists planned a march that was to take them from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery, some 54 miles away. Their route would take the non-violent demonstrators through what amounted to enemy territory, roads and highways controlled by the Alabama State Police.
And they came toward us, beating up with nightsticks, with bullwhips, and trampling us with horses. I was hit in the head and just left lying there. And I felt like it was the last protest.
The violence and brutality which ended this march quickly provoked plans for a much larger one, now joined by Dr. Martin Luther King.
We've gone too far now to turn back.
Dr. King was determined to focus national attention on Selma, and he enlisted the help of supporters from New York to Hollywood.
The Reverend said, the white man can't cool it because he's never dug it.
Marlon Brando was the one that got me involved in civil rights, honestly. I was walking down the street and he just pulled up in the car and he said, how'd you like to go down to Selma? Yeah? I said, Selma, we're gonna have a march from Selma to Montgomery. You wanna come? And I said, sure.
Before the second march had even begun, the Reverend James Reeb, a civil rights sympathizer, was beaten to death by a white mob. But rather than intimidating the marchers, that violence seemed to give them a powerful ally.
That night, I was with Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma when we heard Lyndon Johnson. We watched him make one of the greatest speeches any American president ever made on the whole question of civil rights.
Their cause must be our cause too. It's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
Just think of a president with a Southern accent from Texas saying to the Congress of the United States, we shall overcome. Finally, popular protest and public power had come together.
And Dr. King literally started crying. Tears came down his face. I knew then that we would make it from Selma to Montgomery.
On March 21st, 1965, 3,200 people set out from Selma. Four days later, as the march approached Montgomery, there were 25,000 people marching.
It was an amazing moment. It was scary. It was scary. There were helicopters everywhere, like some sort of angry bugs. And there were only Confederate flags flying, and we were the only ones with American flags. Yeah, and Martin Luther King gave a great speech.
All the world today knows that we are here and we are standing before the forces of power in the state of Alabama saying we ain't gonna let nobody turn us around.
There's very few times in your life that you know that you're at some place that you're at a moment where this is one of those things that as long as there's time is going to be this moment. That was it.
United States of America.
On August the 6th, Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, finally guaranteeing black Americans the right to vote. But just as it reached a high point, the civil rights movement seemed to split into warring factions.
A revolution of rising expectations stirs people to believe that the promised land is there. It was when change was coming, when there was a sense of possibility, that everything broke loose and went wild.
You're better than the white man. You are better than the white man. And that's not saying anything.
Despite the gains of recent years, it seemed to many blacks that the pace of change was too slow, that Martin Luther King was too accommodating. These blacks began to adopt the separatist rhetoric of the charismatic Malcolm X.
I used to hear Malcolm say, if a man slaps me in the face, I'm not turning my cheek. If I slap him back, he won't slap me again. That made a lot of sense.
Malcolm at that time said clearly, all right, what we need is power. While King would say what we need is morality to help bring out, Malcolm said, forget about them, just get guns, and that's how they're going to regulate the problem. The contradiction, however, was that Martin Luther King was involved in action, confronting the enemy. Malcolm X was not. So what you had to do was take the confrontation of King and match it as best you can with the philosophy of Malcolm X, which is precisely what we did.
We want black power. We want black power.
The response was overwhelming.
In 1966, militants in Oakland, California founded the Black Panther Party for self-defense and told America that the fight for civil rights would never be the same.
If you come down here jumping on us and beating us up like you were beating up the peaceful protesters with your dogs, your cattle prods, and are shooting them and are murdering these peaceful protesters, we're not going to take it. When you start shooting, we're shooting back.
The call by militant leaders for total revolution received a sympathetic ear in many of the nation's impoverished inner cities, where the Great Society was still nowhere to be seen.
Well, in the South, where we had a powerful, non-violent movement, people had a way to channel their frustration. In many parts of America, especially outside of the South, the fires of frustration, the fires of discontent were beginning to burn.
In 1967, that anger and discontent exploded into violence in Newark, New Jersey, Detroit, Michigan, and more than 100 other cities. 80 people died in urban riots that summer.
Lyndon Johnson was shocked, I think, at the riots and angry. He took it personally, and he got angry at blacks for being ungrateful for having these great laws had been passed.
Despite his disappointment, Lyndon Johnson believed that his war on poverty could still succeed. All he needed was more money.
Well, the president said to me, you know, we have this war going on now in Vietnam. It's going to take up all of the extra money we have right now to fight that war. But he said, Sarge, look, we're going to be out of that war. That'll be finished in the next 12 to 18 months. As soon as that's finished, I will take the money we now are devoting to the war in Vietnam and we'll put it into the war against poverty. Obviously, that never happened.
In 1964, a British rock band showed up in the United States that was described by one historian as raunchier and more rebellious than the Beatles. They were called the Rolling Stones, and in the mid-1960s, they created a song that became an anthem.
I had one of the first early Norelco sort of cassette players, 1964, 5, and I put it next to the bed and with the guitar. And I crashed out. And when I woke up in the morning, I noticed that the tape had gone to the end, and I'd put it in at the beginning, you know, and I ran it back, pushed play, and somewhere in the middle of the night, I had woken up and played da 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 da. I can't get no satisfaction. And it's there, the verse and the chorus are there, and then it stops, and the rest of the tape is me snoring. Yeah.
Rock music had accompanied America's youth on its journey to the forefront of the nation's consciousness with songs like Satisfaction, #1 on the charts in 1965. The journey took quite a radical turn.
The message is
the ordinary order of things is either broken or corrupt, I can't get no satisfaction. You gotta do something wilder. That's how you'll get your satisfaction. The message, in a sense, is cut loose.
It was music that gave us, as an entity, as a community, a sense of cohesion and a sense of existing, a real sense of being more than a few demonstrations.
The Rolling Stones, Janis Joplin, The Doors, Bob Dylan, all of them sang in a way that invited challenge to the establishment.
I think people were absolutely waking up, but they didn't know exactly how to get out of bed yet and what to do when they put their feet on the floor.
We began to look around for things to do which would alert people to other possibilities, other ways of living.
For some, other possibilities meant completely rejecting the values that had united their parents' generation.
I mean, where is it written in stone that people have to work from 9 to 5?
The Haight-Ashbury section of San Francisco became the center of the counterculture.
Suddenly, there was an environment where your personal history did not matter. Nobody cared who your parents were, whether you were rich, whether you were poor. You'd get up every day, and you had no idea what the day would bring. There were the greatest looking women parading up and down the street. There was a sense of adventure, random combinations. You could catch a woman's eye and offer her your arm, and without a word, walk away and spend an afternoon making love, and if you didn't talk, that was okay.
I was looking for a new way to express myself, you know, and I think everybody was. And unfortunately, a lot of people went to drugs because it came naturally out of what we were doing at the time.
It's a food for the soul. Right now, I'm on LSD. Right now, every color is going through my mind.
The psychedelic drug LSD became a rite of passage for many in the counterculture.
These were awfully hard on people who were in their 40s at that time. Just awfully hard with the hair and the drugs and the music and the dirty clothes and the foul language that all became au courant, regardless of the political position one took.
Brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, if you truly care about your
Despised by many people in the older generation, the social ferment of the 1960s would nonetheless change forever the way young Americans looked at themselves. A long dormant struggle for equality was revived by the new freedom that many young women were feeling. Women were given more choice with the introduction of the birth control pill.
We could now control when and if we chose to have children. And it helped to propel, I think, the development of a women's movement.
In the 1960s, discrimination against women was solidly entrenched, particularly in the workplace. Job ads were divided into sections marked male and female. Airline stewardesses were simply dismissed on their 32nd birthday.
But the great majority of American women are not participating in terms of their full potential and ability.
In 1966, a group of feminists, most notably Betty Friedan, founded the National Organization for Women. This was a turning point in the women's liberation movement that was typical of many struggles at the time. Thus began another era of militancy.
Women have been particularly oppressed, and now women are on the move, and there ain't going to be no stopping us.
This one was my struggle, in which I was the actor.
New Miss America stands 5 feet 7, weighs 125 pounds, and measures 36, 24 and a half, 36.
On September the 7th, 1968, the new Miss America was crowned in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Outside, 200 women demonstrated against the pageant. They threw their bras and their high-heel shoes, which they called instruments of oppression, into so-called freedom trash cans.
Women use your brains, not your bodies.
We had learned that from the civil rights movement. You demonstrate, you stand up, you get in their face, and you get behind the scenes and you pass your legislation. We learned. We were political.
Take the point.
For American soldiers in the field, it was grinding and bloody. But by mid-1966, the Vietnam War was settling into just the kind of conflict that General William Westmoreland believed America would win, a war of attrition. What General Westmoreland didn't recognize was that the North Vietnamese also saw a war they could win, as long as they didn't meet the Americans head-on.
The booby trap, the landmine, the raid, the ambush. Any square yard of Vietnam could be this absolutely, utterly peaceful place 1 second. And the next second, it was the end of the world.
We are not fighting a conventional war. We would go in a kind of surprise attack and then withdraw immediately. Very effective.
As the U.S. grew frustrated by its inability to score decisive victories against the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, the administration continued to pour more men and more machinery into Vietnam. By mid-1967, close to 500,000 Americans were involved in the fight. In the face of these escalations, the North Vietnamese continually adapted their strategies. The only option they never discussed among themselves was surrender.
As long as a live Vietnamese there, the resistance would go on. We just wouldn't accept a two Vietnam.
If that rice is wet, spread it out on the ground, otherwise burn it.
For American troops, most of whom left Vietnam after 1 year of duty, things were not quite as clear at all. Almost anyone was a potential enemy, as the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong enjoyed widespread sympathy in South Vietnam. In such an atmosphere of confusion, areas were conquered and then abandoned, villages saved and then destroyed.
I believe I'm correct in saying that in the past 4.5 years, the Viet Cong, the communists, have lost 89,000 men, killed.
Many Americans were dying too, without ever understanding what they'd been fighting for.
There was one kid who was grievously injured, and I had my arms around him, trying to comfort him, but he was losing consciousness, and he just kept staring up with an expression on his face of, why, what's happening to me, what's happening to me. By then, 1967 and 68, when we were losing hundreds a week in that same fashion, you had to start questioning how much longer could this go on.
On January the 20th, 1968, U.S. Marines got involved in a battle with the North Vietnamese near the American base at Khe Sanh. It was the beginning of a critical campaign. For several weeks, the North Vietnamese hammered Khe Sanh and its defenders.
We were moving our way up the trench line, and it came to a machine gun bunk, and someone was firing a machine gun. And I said, "Where's everybody else?" And he said, "There isn't anybody else." And I said, "Where's your crew?" And he said, "They're gone."
The siege continued throughout February and into March. At home, television viewers were shocked by the spectacle. Jack Brunson was a medic.
They screamed for me, they screamed for their mothers. It is not like the movies. You are looking at this person who is begging not to die. And the first question they always would ask me, am I going to make it, Doc? And I had to lie a lot of times. When I was hit, I knew I was hurt bad. And I can remember laying there, and I could hear the Vietnamese, because they kept throwing grenades in. I could hear them talking. And I can remember saying to myself, you were going to die.
Severely wounded, Jack Brunson would return home, to a country unsure what to make of his sacrifice. In late March, the North Vietnamese simply melted away, and Khe Sanh became another in a growing tally of dubious victories, a base desperately fought over and then abandoned.
Yeah, I don't know. They say we're fighting for something. I don't know.
By now, many Americans on the home front didn't see the Vietnam War as one of national survival. Opposition to the high price being paid in American servicemen began to build.
As we began to see what was happening in that war, watching on television, it was stunning. You know, it was something that we had never seen. We'd never seen that face of war. You know, it was always World War II, the good war. And nobody ever saw the Korean War. I mean, how many pictures have you ever seen of the Korean War? Suddenly, there it was, 6 o'clock. You know, there were bodies and firefights.
What made the experiences of the Vietnam War generation so different from those of the World War II? Their parents hadn't had TV when they were kids. That made them different from every generation that had gone before.
The anti-war demonstrators in the United States now took their protests to a new level. Stu Ewan took part in one of the growing number of demonstrations against the war.
The confrontation was very intense. The cops very suddenly had moved in on people and started to crack heads, and they beat people pretty badly. There was a lot of blood, there were a lot of injuries, and all of a sudden, people understood themselves as being at odds with the powers that be. That for us was a signal that we needed to come back strong, become more militant.
In trying to stop the war in Vietnam, the demonstrations intensified the war at home.
Yeah, burn the back flag, burn the back flag.
There was a class dimension to the Vietnam protests. To a large extent, it was college kids saying they didn't want to go fight this war, that they didn't see much point in. So the blue-collar kids did. It was one of the uglier things about the Vietnam War, that to what extent it was fought by the less fortunate in the society.
In February and March 1968, television brought another set of horrifying images home to Americans. U.S. soldiers were fighting for their lives from one end of South Vietnam to the other. The U.S. Embassy in Saigon was being overrun. This was the Tet Offensive, a military defeat for the North Vietnamese, but ultimately a political victory. Despite hearing repeatedly that there was light at the end of the tunnel, most Americans came to realize they were not going to win the war in Vietnam anytime soon, if ever. On March the 31st, 1968, with the presidential election just a few months away, an exhausted Lyndon Johnson seemed to come to the same conclusion.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
And I looked at the guys in the bunker with me, and I said, he's getting out. And the other guy said, what do you mean? I said, he's not going to run for president. He's not running anymore. He's getting out. He's the commander-in-chief. And so if he's getting out, what are we doing here?
In America, in 1968, peace and understanding were fast becoming distant memories. As the Vietnam War became the longest war in American history, over 100 college campuses were racked by furious protest. In the spring, many of the nation's cities exploded once again with racial violence, propelled by the terrible events of April the 4th, 1968.
When I heard over the news that Martin Luther King had been shot in Memphis and then seconds later killed in Memphis, it was as if a member of my family had been killed. And it said to me, here's this guy has been going around preaching peace and nonviolence and peaceful resistance, and now someone has shot him dead. And it shattered my belief that we could work these things out in a peaceful way.
It's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in.
That night, Robert Kennedy, the leading candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination, announced King's death to a room full of campaign workers. In Kennedy, many Americans, both black and white, saw a man who could turn back the tide of violence. 2 months after the death of Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy was killed.
My wife came into the bedroom and said, you know what they've done now? They shot Bobby Kennedy. Just they, a sort of paranoid moment of our own, just a sense of everything coming undone.
And you never quite get over it. You no longer feel safe in your life the way you did as a child when your parents were alive. In those turbulent days, you felt you never really will be safe.
Will the convention be in order?
In late August, the city of Chicago was the host city for the Democratic National Convention.
Will the convention will the sergeant at arms enforce order in the convention?
Delegates from all 50 states arrived to find Chicago an armed camp. The city's mayor, Richard Daley, knew that tens of thousands of young demonstrators were also on their way.
They're here as guests of the Democratic Party, and let them conduct themselves accordingly.
They were determined to have their say.
All across the country, the new left was trying to provoke people into actions that would escalate the whole thing. You never saw people so provoked in all your life as those Chicago police. The things those kids said to them.
I take one look at these pigs out here and I know what America's about.
The gestures they made to them, deliberately designed to bring on this reaction.
It seemed to many the country itself was coming apart. In November, America elected a new president who promised to heal the nation's wounds. Richard Milhous Nixon.
We're gonna sock it to them from now.
Just as American unity and confidence seem to be crumbling, a man from Ohio lands on the moon. We'll see that on the next episode of The Century, America's Time. Thank you for joining us. I'm Peter Jennings.